program. I'm also a member of the OFPN steering committee, so I will be kicking off our first breakout session today, prioritizing equity in local food councils. We have two great speakers today. Haley Caretta, who's the Food Systems Program Manager with Public Health Dayton and Montgomery County, will share a framework of the Montgomery County Food Equity Coalition and the development of their food equity plan. And then we will be followed by Kip Holley, who is with Ohio State University's Kirwin Institute, and he will share findings and recommendations from the Columbus and Franklin County Local Food Board's Racial Equity Assessment. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Haley. Feel free to introduce yourself further, share your screen, and go forward with your presentation slides.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and I'll share my screen first and get this. This is always the most nerve-wracking part, right, of a presentation. So let me get this pulled up. All right, can everyone see my first slide? Great. Well, again, my name is Haley Caretta. I'm the Food Systems Program Manager at Public Health Dayton and Montgomery County. And I'm here today to talk to you about the Montgomery County Food Equity Coalition. I think we have a fairly unique process in Montgomery County for how we're addressing some of our health priorities. So I'm really excited to share that with you today and answer any questions you have as well. So, first I understand that we have folks on the call from all over the state and perhaps even outside of Ohio. So I first just want to make sure that we're all aware of who we are in Montgomery County. And I'm going to start with what I think is one of the most important things about Montgomery County. We invented Cheez-Its. So of course, I'm kidding here, but we really did invent Cheez-Its in Dayton. And this is something I learned a few months ago, early on in the pandemic, when, Cheez-Its were a big joke on the internet. And so I always think this is just funny. We're here today to talk about food, so let's have a good time with it. But yes, you can thank Dayton for why we have Cheez-Its now. But being serious, in Montgomery County, we have just over 530,000 residents. Our median income is about 47,000. We are part of the largest network of paved trails in the United States, which is a pretty cool fun fact about us in Southwest Ohio. We're also, home to Dayton, which is what many folks would know us for. And we are known for innovation and resiliency. I think the Cheez-Its are a big part of that for innovation, but we also have invented a lot of other really cool things. I hope you get some time to come visit some of our museums to kind of learn more about that history of Montgomery County and Dayton. But at the same time, we face a lot of the same issues that other communities in Ohio face. So we're impacted by racial disparities in health. We have a decreasing lifespan, and we have high rates of chronic disease, just like many of your communities in Ohio. And we also face a food equity issue. And so, speaking about who are we really here to represent, in Montgomery County, we have just under 76,000 residents that are considered food insecure. I do think it's important to note these are 2019 numbers. So we are well aware that this number is probably higher now. And that's not something that we're proud of, but this pandemic's been hard on our communities and all of us and our families. And so this is something we're actively looking at. How do we capture what that really looks like now during this pandemic? We also have just over 75,000 residents that are on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program in Montgomery County. And we have 34% of our children have low access to a store. And these are the latest USDA maps for food deserts in the country. And so in Montgomery County, food deserts don't tell the whole story. We know that, but we do think they're still an important part of the data piece when we're thinking about who do we represent and how do we prioritize and think about equity. And so the yellow areas would be where we see folks with less opportunity to access to health fresh foods that are affordable. So you'll notice, some of the things we look at is a lot of the western half of the county is considered food desert. Essentially all of the city of Trotwood is considered a food desert. We see portions in the south here. This would be like some of West Carrollton or Moraine, if you're familiar with those sections. And then here would be Huber Heights, Riverside, and North Dayton. And then, we've been well aware of these issues in Montgomery County for a while, and we haven't just been sitting on it, not doing anything. So this is the Montgomery County Joint Strategic Plan. And when we were starting to think about, okay, what can we do differently in Montgomery County to address our food system? These are some things we looked at. This is the County and United Way Joint Strategic Plan. And these are some things that they were already prioritizing. They were already providing funding in these areas and food equity, and also really trying to support mandates that we have, but then also evidence-based strategies that have been working well in our community and other communities. And you can see how those fit when it comes to education and life skills, health and safety, and income and stability. So I feel like we were already on this really good track of, we know what works, but how do we start to see some differences in these numbers? How do we really start to improve families across Montgomery County? And so that is when in 2018, we started this planning process. And we were just asked to get together some individuals to talk about what would be the best things that we could do. So we talked about what's the data that we have. We were lucky that there were already some community surveys, but how could we do some more surveying? How could we talk to the community? How could we talk to nonprofits, residents to gather more information about what they saw as our barriers and our facilitators to improving food equity, and what did they need and what did they want to see in their community? And then also existing resources. We looked at what's the work already going on in our county? What is our friends in Columbus and Cincinnati and Cleveland doing? What are best practices across the country? And so we spent quite a few months with different groups talking about these things. And we met regularly. We had a facilitator that helped us work through, what does that solution look like for us? So this is when we developed our project scope. We decided that, and I apologize, I'm not sure why this is cutting off now, but develop a comprehensive system-wide approach to improving community food systems in Montgomery County. And this was we decided community food security was a definition from whole measures. And this is a condition in which all community residents obtain a safe and culturally appropriate, nutritionally sound diet through economically and environmentally sustainable food systems that promote community self-reliance and social justice. And so we wanted this to be the heart of what we were doing. And we wanted to make sure that definition really represented and had something that when things came up, how do we keep focusing again on what our mission is? And that's really where we came up with this definition that we adopted. We also talked about, what should this plan look like? We knew at this point we needed a food plan, but what are some things we needed to think about when we were developing that food equity plan? So we talked about addressing the entire food system from farm to fork. We wanted to create a collective impact structure, which I'll get into here in a second. We wanted to enhance communication and coordination between agencies and resources. Like I mentioned, there was already fantastic work going on in Montgomery County. We just needed to figure out a way to make sure that everyone's working together. We know that working in silos does not work for any public health issue. And so how do we enhance that coordination piece and communication piece? At the time, I think many of us were going to different, food-related meetings throughout the county where you would be talking about the same thing, but it would be like 50% of the same people with a couple other folks thrown in. And then the next day you go to another meeting and talk about the same things. And so it was like, how do we start to be more productive? We also wanted to promote health equity. That was very important to us here in Montgomery County. And we wanted to increase economic development opportunities related to healthy food. We knew that focusing on economic development was also a very important piece to us to improving community food security in Montgomery County. And then lastly, we wanted to make sure we could implement measurable goals and objectives. I think we all know that that is extremely important for your work. If you want to show outcomes, is that you have something that's measurable and objective. And I've always said for food, when it comes from a public health standpoint, food is always one of those more difficult ones to regularly measure. We're not looking at morbidity and mortality in the same way as you would for other public health priorities. So that's always, you have to be a little more creative here when you think about how are we going to measure goals and objectives on a consistent, regular basis. So we came up with the Food Equity Coalition. This is where we started, that we're gonna develop a coalition that helps us come up with this food equity plan. And so this is our logo. Again, we wanted to make sure that equity continued to be the center of what we were talking about. We want to make sure we were supporting our residents that most needed us, that needed to help us make sure they had the opportunities to live a happy, healthy life, just like others that maybe live in higher income neighborhoods with plenty of grocery store options. They have a reliable car. You know, those are the folks that we wanted to help the most, is the ones that don't have that same opportunity. So here's a couple of the frameworks that we looked at in Montgomery County that really identify who the Montgomery County Coalition is. We strive on collective impact. This is really about us having a shared vision where we all work together to really have to show that success around that vision. And so we had a backbone organization that was decided would be public health. And that's when my role was created. We decided, well, how are we going to really prioritize food equity if we don't have someone working on this full time? And so that's when the food system project manager position was created at public health. We had a common agenda. That's where we'll talk about the food equity plan. That's really what we viewed as we all need to be working towards the same things. Shared measurements, again, was especially important to us. Mutually reinforcing activities. That's within food equity, but then also in other health priorities too. How do we work together better, not just in food systems, but across the county as well? And continuous communication. I think we're all aware that sometimes one of the most frustrating things is, oh, I could have helped with that, but I didn't know about it, or my organization really could have been a big support for that, but we didn't know about it. And so we wanted to create a mechanism so that everyone could continuously communicate, foster relationships, foster ideas, and have a space to do that where they feel safe as well. One of the other things in Montgomery County that we really like to use for our public health priorities is the National Incident Management System. If you are with a health department on the call right now, I will say, unfortunately, you become very familiar with this. This would be what at a national level, but then also at a state and local level that we use to address an emergency. And so this is something that talks about how do we look across jurisdictional levels and across functional disciplines to address something that impacts all of us. It helps improve coordination and cooperation amongst public and private entities, and it provides a common standard for overall incident management. So a little bit about the incident command system. This is used to manage local, state, and federal responses to complex, multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional issues. It helps coordination, it helps optimize collective impact. It really is very specific in defining roles and responsibilities. It helps make sure we have assured decision-making, we support constant communication, and use an incident action plan, which I will talk about in a second. And it's scalable. We really felt like our food system in Montgomery County was a public health priority and an emergency issue. We have folks that don't know where their next meal is going to come from. We continue to have grocery stores that close on a pretty consistent basis, even still today. And so really, how do we really thought that using this system could help us do that and get the partners at the table that we needed. So the incident action plan, probably one of the little different things that we do here for the Food Equity Coalition is we develop an incident action plan right now that's quarterly, but when we started the coalition in 2019, that was every 30 days actually. And this is just really an update on what are we doing, what do we plan to do, and what do we need help with. And so when you look through the reports, they are very action oriented. There's not a lot of fluff in them. They're very much of here's the completed actions, here's the planned actions, here's the current actions. When are they going to be done? What supports do you need? And this is something that we create and actively review. It really helps us to make sure that we stay action oriented and we're looking for measurable goals and objectives. So this really, keeps you moving. You never want to see one of those incident action plans where there's not a lot of information in it. So, the Food Equity Coalition in Montgomery County wasn't the first one to come up with those frameworks for addressing a public health issue. So this is an example of Montgomery County's Community Overdose Action Team that had already been using those same frameworks around collective impact and incident command system to address overdose deaths in Montgomery County. They were having good success. They had seen a dramatic drop. At one point, we were one of the top places in the country for the highest overdose deaths, and they've done really great and innovative work to change that and save lives. So I'm not going to go through their structure, but you're going to kind of see where we're going with this. And we also had the Everyone Reach One task force in Montgomery County, which again, as you kind of look through it, it looks kind of the same names. And this was used and still is used for addressing maternal and infant vitality in Montgomery County, which is another public health priority. So they were already using that same framework, utilizing the incident action plans to address this issue as well. The one thing that we did differently with the food equity plan is we wanted to use whole measures for community food systems. This is a value-based, community-oriented tool for evaluation and planning and dialogue. It's about making nutritious and culturally appropriate food accessible, supporting a local sustainable food system, providing fair wages and conditions, promoting social justice, and empowering diverse people to work together. And so, we really felt like this again was back to that definition of community food security and what the Food Equity Coalition really wanted to strive to work towards and keep us, right at the heart of equity. So this is what our system looks like. This would be our organization chart for the Food Equity Coalition. You'll notice we have a steering committee. This would be our health commissioner, our city and county commissioners, as well as Ambassador Tony Hall. These are the ones that really allowed us to do this work and give us that support to continue. They're the ones that said, yes, public health needs a full-time person to help manage this coalition. They're the ones that help give us the funding to do this work. And so their support is immeasurable to keep us moving. And they're wonderful to work with. And they're the ones that really have all this happen. And then you'll see the backbone support. This would be our leaders that I like to say can come to a meeting and say, yes, my organization can do this. They're not someone that has to go back and get it okayed. They're someone that can speak on behalf of their organization in a meeting. There are people that are mostly well aware of our food system, but some that just bring really interesting viewpoints from other priorities in Montgomery County or know a lot about other things going on in the county that can help make sure we guide the vision and strategies, support aligned activities, advance policy, mobilize resources, and identify gaps in services. We also really, right now, we have some community representation here, but we'd really like to beef up our community residents here in this section. It's kind of one of the things we've been focusing on right now. Then you'll see operations and planning section. This would be where our co-leads sit. So you'll see these 6 branches here these are actually, when you see food insecurity, strong communities, vibrant farms, these are actually the 6 identified areas and whole measures for community food system. This is really what they look at to say, are we making an improvement in our food system? These are those important components. So these are all different subcommittees. We call them branches, but these are made up of different folks and there are co-leads for each section. So the operations and planning section would be where all the co-leads get together to implement the action plan, and make sure we're not working in silos. So even though that we have these sub branches here, how do we make sure that we still don't just stick to our little group? We still work across the board. And then these blue and purple sections, these are ones that we're still working on developing, but as the time comes, we're right now talking about starting up a data unit. Also, we're really hoping, once we get a big grant, we'll have a finance unit that'll help coordinate funding sources and how do we make sure that we're doing that in an equitable manner. And a joint information center. We do this, but not probably in an official meeting capacity. How do we just coordinate common messaging, respond to media requests so we don't all say the same thing or we all have the same statistics and utilize, the same key messages. And they assist any of the branches with communications that they would need. So that's promoting an event they're doing or promoting a food summit or any issue if there's a resource we need folks to know about. So then we developed our food equity plan, and I'm just going to quickly go through this, but I'm happy to share some links in the chat box with you after I'm done to kind of guide you to these things. But the first thing the coalition did was develop a food equity plan. So each of the branches, again, went back to that data, community residents, what they were wanting, and they were a part of this as well. Surveys, what was already going on, where did we need to go? So we decided that our mission was we wanted to measure 3 key things: decrease food waste, increase availability of healthy, affordable local food, and decrease food insecurity. So that's kind of our overarching, these are the things that we at the end of the day want to see a change in. And our objectives, they match a lot about what I've already talked about. These are key objectives and collective impact, incident command system, and whole measures. We want to develop shared measurements, communication and coordination. It's just those key things, again, that we want to live and breathe by. And then each of the branches has something like this. They have what their goals are and their key measures are. Now, we don't see these are things that are going to be completed overnight or even in a year. These are overarching. How do we continue to address these key priorities? And that may change of how that looks like from time to time. So for food insecurity, for instance, they're looking at childhood hunger. How do we look at new and relocated programs? This would be like with the food bank. Where should their mobile unit be? Where should food pantries be? Does that change sometimes? And number of partner agencies reporting increased capacity. The food bank here in Dayton does a fantastic job supporting food pantries. And so this is really where they look at how do we help make sure the food pantries have what they need to feed as many people as possible. Our Strong Communities branch is really the heart of the coalition. This is where we see our most of our residents sit. They're really thinking about how do we amplify the voice of residents and how do we make sure that we're promoting resources that are available to them or where resources should be available to them. Sustainable ecosystems pretty much speaks for itself here. This is about soil management, food waste, composting. This is really what we're talking about with sustainable ecosystems. Our Healthy People brand, really just one of their big goals is to develop healthy food zones in areas with low community food security. So they are really prioritizing certain areas of Montgomery County where we see that we need to focus most of our time in to develop how do we just bring as many different initiatives to an area to really study them, understand how they work, and then expand those. Vibrant Farms is about supporting our local farmers and producers. So some of that's just how do we make sure we enhance communication amongst them so they can continue sharing ideas or sharing resources, so exploring and supporting distribution and aggregation mechanism, promoting education programs, and providing some financial support. And our Thriving Local Economy branch gets back to jobs. How do we look at businesses and jobs around our food system? You can see, one of the things I haven't talked about today is what have we been up to. And so I'll post a link again to our annual report. I hope you guys get a chance to read it. That'll go through kind of what's going on in Montgomery County around each of those different areas with some statistics in there as well. And I hope you all can join our food summit, which is coming up on the 18th of this month. This is where you'll hear about some really cool projects going on in Montgomery County. I'm just really proud of the work that our partners do. I'll be giving more of an update on what the Food Equity Coalition's been up to, but we just have some really cool projects to talk about that I hope y'all get a chance to join. It's virtual and it's free. And all these resources I've mentioned can be found on our website here at mcfoodequitycoalition.org, or feel free to contact me if you have any more questions. So I know that was quick, but I hope that was just a little bit about what we're working on here in Montgomery County, and I'll pass it now on to Kip or Sarah.
Thanks, Haley. That was great. We will have some time for questions at the end, and feel free to put those in the chat if you have something top of mind now. Next, I will turn it over to Kip Holley from the Kirwin Institute. Kip, go ahead and share your slides. Get started.
Will do. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everybody for having me. I too will try to make sure that my screen sharing works out. There we go. Can everyone see my screen? All right, first hurdle down. So welcome, thank you everybody for inviting me to speak. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to the summit for allowing me to speak a little bit on the racial equity study that I conducted on behalf of the local food board in Central Ohio, and share some of the results in terms of engaging with Black communities, specifically around equity and empowerment, not only in terms of food inequity, but also larger inequities. As Sarah mentioned earlier, my name is Kip Holley, and I am a researcher at the Kirwin Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State. But I did this work as an independent consultant working for Kip Holley Consulting. And this is a really, really quick overview of a study that I just completed along with the partners of the local food plan, action plan in Columbus. We just completed the study last month, but we wanted to kind of share at least some of the findings from the study and some of the things that were really, really interesting talking points in terms of maybe future strategies or ideals for engaging around racial equity in food, and how to maybe expand that into empowerment through some of the recommendations that we had. With the thought that some of these ideals may be useful for all of you as you go forth in working around food equity. So I'll just, I should probably, there we go. So I'll start off just by talking about where this work started for us. In last year, the local food board put out a statement on racism in the food system, and really talking about racism as a public health crisis. And that acted kind of as sort of a seminal moment of not only pushing the local food board and partners of the local food board to really redouble our efforts at thinking about how racism affects our lives, how racism is present in the food system, how racism is present in many of our structures in the wake of the protests for Black lives earlier in that year, but also as kind of a starting point for rethinking its own work in particularly engaging with Black communities around issues related to food security, food inequity, and how the local food board could sort of enliven its place there. And so basically the idea was, kind of, looking to study ways, take a study of racial equity in Central Ohio and understand at the end how to kind of go from the statement to make it actionable, basically. So having put that statement out there, the local food board and its partner organizations were thinking, how can we make this actionable as part of our local food action plan that is already ongoing, but that we want to expand and enliven in a way to really address racial equities and build relationships specifically with Black communities around racial equity. And it was a really great thought because, of course, food security is related to all sorts of other areas of racial inequity in our society. When we start talking about food insecurity and food inequity, we're invariably talking about health inequality, we're talking about transportation, education inequality, and inequality in a lot of other areas. And also when people are talking about inequality in many of these other areas, often food insecurity and racialized barriers to food security are a part of that conversation. And so there's really no way to talk about sort of food equity without reaching out to other people who are talking about these areas, specifically in Black communities. And so the sort of brief that we had for this work was to think about, how community engagement could be repositioned within the local food plan to address racial inequities internally and externally through the lens of food advocacy. So basically, that was kind of the sort of crux of the study, is to think about, now that we've made the statement, now that we are sort of on the other side of the statement and wanting to move forward into action, how can we sort of think about community engagement with communities of color, specifically Black communities, in a different way through our food equity work. And that was an interesting question for the local food action plan, because actually the local food action plan is sort of forwarded by a partnership, what I usually like to call the local food action plan partners, of organizations that support the implementation of this plan and have been doing so for 5 years. And so that includes the local food board, which is appointed jointly by the Columbus City Council and Franklin County Board of Commissioners, the Franklin County Local Food Council, which is a volunteer organization that also plays an advisory and community engagement role in this work, and a local food action team and project teams that are sort of, comprised of these two organizations and are sort of mostly responsible for the implementation of specific steps. So instead of just having to think about how does one entity, enliven its relationship with one community around equity issues and around food equity, it's basically how this partnership comes together in a different way to address racial equity with what actually ends up being very diverse Black communities, which we'll talk about in a moment. And so our plan really took shape around those particular issues. And when we started our study, we started with the idea that we were going to end with 3 types of recommendations. Recommendations for engaging with Black communities from where they're at, recommendations for internal changes, that could be made within that partnership to create better engagement structures, and learning and self-reflexive practices internally to sort of better understand the board members and the partners' relationship to race and racism, to privilege, to things like whiteness and white supremacy, and how those play out. And so really thinking about recommendations on how to, maybe improve in all of these areas in order to engage in a more empowering and meaningful way around food equity issues in Black communities. And so the study really started to take shape around collecting a certain amount of data. And this includes most prominently an analysis of previous engagement. So in Central Ohio specifically, there's been a wealth of different engagement, predominantly Black communities, particularly over the last 10 years, as Columbus has grown, and more sort of projects from all sorts of areas, from various institutions, from different development types of projects have come along. And in those projects, there's been a wealth of different types of engagement strategies that have been utilized, and there's been a wealth of feedback from Black communities that is already out there in the public. And we thought, rather than coming back to these communities once again, asking for more information without having a clear plan on how it's going to benefit them, we wanted to make use of the information that they've already given us. And so that was really, really important to look back at what's been tried and what Black communities have talked about wanting from their relationships with institutions. We also did an analysis of previous engagement activities related to the local food action plan. We did interviews with internal and external stakeholders. And we also prominently did a literature review centering around 3 different types of information. We looked at the diversity within Black communities and the Black diaspora in Central Ohio and abroad. We looked at food-based engagement from different food policy councils and entities from around the country to look at what people were doing. And we were looking at community engagement strategies that were specifically focused on political and economic empowerment from across the country, just to see what those things were, whether they were involved in food or not, because we wanted to get more of that information about how we could turn engagement into empowerment as well. And we came away with 3 findings that I'll talk about in more depth here in a moment. But we came away with a greater appreciation for the diversity within Black communities, realizing that our communities are not monolithic. They are actually made up of a wealth of interracial diversity in terms of socioeconomic status, ethnicity, area of interest and expertise, and the gifts that people are giving, and the challenges that are faced by structural racism. There are quite a bit. That we also found that the current community engagement landscape in Central Ohio often offers little empowerment for Black residents and Black community members. And then finally, that the local food action plan partners found themselves at an inflection point when it comes to how they want to address racial equity and how they want to engage with community members on a broader level. And so, addressing that internal ambiguity and addressing those challenges in terms of resources were also an important finding. And so that changed us quite a bit in terms of the recommendations that we came away with at the end. So the recommendations that we ended up coming up with really skewed much larger to sort of this internal exploration of coordination and communication and resources, seeing how the local food action plan partners needed to maybe think and change about how they were thinking about how they coordinated around community engagement, how they sort of addressed racial equity, and how they wanted to do things, going forward. Not that things were bad beforehand, but given the expanded nature of what they were looking to do, it may take a moment to reflect internally to think about how they want to do it. The second big chunk was around broadening engagement. So rather than going straight into empowering politically or economically, we realized that the local food action plan partners needed to build a better relationship with these with various Black communities and residents in order to gain a greater understanding of those types of events and activities and grassroots advocacy that was already going on, how it was connected, and how the local food action plan could play a part in supporting that rather than coming in and imposing something new. And finally, after all of that, we talk about how to take that collective social capital and that collective internal learning and use that to eventually turn engagement into strategies for political and economic empowerment down the road. And that has probably the least amount of recommendations at the moment, because the most important things tend to be those things that need to come first. And if those two things are done right, often turning engagement into empowerment may be something that the local food action plan partners can learn from their broadening relationships with these community members. And so just stop and talk a little bit about the findings before I go forward. So we'll start and talk about, how the diversity of Black communities, as we were talking about, diverse in many ways. And I think that this is not known. I think this is something we all know, but it's not very well appreciated in many of the community engagement strategies that we find in Black communities, particularly around equity issues. Black communities tend to be sort of treated as a monolith because Black communities and Black community members are all affected by structural racism. But as we were talking about before, and as was shown in a lot of the readings and a lot of the feedback that we got locally, how people are able to cope with structural racism and move within it is highly dependent on some of the differences in terms of background, in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of where we're living, in terms of how we're sort of interacting with systems and institutions. And all those things are different. And most importantly, they can't be really known beforehand. They can be known by getting into and deepening relationships with various residents, with various micro communities, to have a greater and more accurate understanding of both the challenges and gifts of Black communities. Along with that, we talked about Black communities not being well served uniformly by much of the engagement infrastructure in Central Ohio. And that's largely due to a mismatch that I noticed as we were going through the study and looking at past engagement activities. What we would see is institutions would have engagement efforts that were based on maybe informing about projects, or maybe consulting and gaining feedback about sort of projects or initiatives that were basically already set. And what we would hear from Black residents is a desire for direct empowerment, direct support, and direct autonomy over creating policy and creating economic development. And often, sometimes in those same communities, maybe sometimes even with those same institutions, maybe a few years down the line, the cycle would repeat. Institutions would come in and form about another project and hear the same thing from communities. And what that tended to result in is a longstanding mismatch between what institutions did and were able to offer in terms of a relationship with these community members, and what community members wanted and needed in terms of affecting policy and gaining access to resources and wealth building and economic entertainment and economic opportunities. Finally, looking inwardly at organizational readiness for deep engagement. As we talked about before, the local food action plan partners found themselves at an inflection point of having done work for 5 years as part of the plan, of the Franklin County Local Food Council having been around for 10 years, and all of this work happening in the midst of an unprecedented global pandemic and an unprecedented sort of push to center Black lives in our policies and procedures. And so the ambiguity that we found was not unsurprising, but it really did create a platform for sort of rethinking about how these partnerships and how these partners wanted to come together in maybe new and different ways, maybe reshape the way they thought about how their mission should proceed even outside the local food plan in terms of engaging around issues of racial equity. So maybe enlivening different types of engagement opportunities and relationship building opportunities, even outside of implementing the plan. That kind of led into another conversation about long-term strategic focus, and that long-term engagement, particularly with communities that are already burdened, needs a strategic focus, whether that be bringing resources or helping community members influence policy or strengthening communities in different ways and resources. What sort of way did the local food action plan partners want to benefit Black communities through their engagement is a question that need to be asked. Also, beyond that is funding and securing long-term funding and partnerships for engagement. Engagement is often seen as kind of an afterthought of other funding. And the recommendation from this study was to look for funding and partnerships that were specific to engagement and specific to sort of supporting long-term engagement and organizational learning in order to create better engagement structures for Black communities. And finally, creating plans to learn from the engagement and relationship building with Black communities, and also making plans to learn from other organizations, not only in Central Ohio, but from across the country, about empowering strategies for Black communities through food. So really making learning about engagement a part of the engagement strategy was another finding that we had. And so in the end, that led us to a lot of recommendations, north of 80 recommendations. And I won't go into all 80 recommendations here because we would be here for a long time if I did. But I want to talk briefly about just some of the sort of overviews of the sort of themes of the recommendations that we had and how they all kind of fit together. You know, we conceptualized the recommendations that we had kind of like a tree. Because what we were really talking about was growing the LFAP partnership into an empowering stance with respect to community engagement with Black communities. So it wasn't really about just recommending some best practices. It was about recommending practices for the partnership to grow internally and then grow its relationship with community members as it was growing in order to finally, become a sort of change and grow with the community to deliver empowering engagement structures related to political and economic empowerment down the line. And so you see at the bottom, you have our roots of internal exploration, which is a large part of the recommendations. That leads to the trunk of broadening engagement. And finally, if those things are done right, it leads to the fruits of empowerment, if it's done right. And so I'll just talk briefly about each one of these types of recommendations, and then, kind of wrap up and give time for questions if need be. Internal exploration is basically what we talked about before. We were talking about their recommendations around how to sort of commence these internal conversations, whether it be facilitated conversations, retreats, different types of learning experiences, to kind of get hold of how do we want to work together now for racial equity and community engagement. That could also lead to examining assets and challenges, which we collected a series of those for the plan, and that could make for a really good conversation in the midst of this, exploring funding and resources, and of what we talked about, exploring engagement strategies and focus, not only internally, but also through a network of different engagement people. Moving on to broadening engagement, we really wanted to kind of focus the first engagement after the LFAP partnership is done with the internal exploration around listening and relationship building. So often organizations start off really wanting to come in and develop an entire structure of community engagement off the bat, and are really excited about moving into empowerment early, but often miss the important part of truly understanding what community needs are, what community gifts and skills and abilities are, and creating these kind of relationships over the long term that can allow those empowering structures to be more vibrant and be more meaningful to community members. And that can really only happen through long-term engagement with community. And so we have recommendations related to normalizing the presence of the partnership in the community by sort of finding out and being invited to various grassroots advocacy things that are already ongoing in community, whether that be directly related to food or other types of advocacy. In Central Ohio, there are a number of grassroots organizations and groups that could always use more support and use access to networks that the partners have. And we felt that that might be a good thing to bring to those relationships, to kind of build relationships and begin listening to community members. We also talked about expanding the community-facing infrastructure of the partnership already to sort of invite people into the local food action plan on a long-term basis, whether that be things like monthly meetings or some sort of capacity building structures that they can build, or maybe a networking environment or event that will allow grassroots people to have access to some of these sort of policy spaces and policy people that they might not have access to before through the local food action plan. And that really kind of rolls up into creating this bridge between relationship building and empowerment. So we're starting with listening and relationship building, and eventually moving towards empowerment through resources and networks and things of that nature. And finally, after a few years of that sort of relationship building, the research and my experience really point towards that being sort of the grist of the mill for developing more broad and far-reaching engagement infrastructure alongside Black community members and residents as partners. So instead of creating for Black communities, we'd be creating with or supporting Black community members, advocates, grassroots members in creating structures on their own. And so there are two things that we talked about here: developing alternative policy networks through helping develop policy and bring policy development tools and expertise to grassroots organizations that may not have them, building a platform for policy action and advocacy through the resources and connections that the local food action plan already has, and also building alternative support structures for when institutions are not as supportive of grassroots Black advocacy or organizations. There are sort of alternative structures that can be built or supported along with the local food action plan. And so that's kind of a large ask. This plan is sort of designed to happen and unfold over a series of years, and there's a lot of changes that would be necessary. So another thing that we talked about is, what can we do now? What can the local food action plan partners do, in the midst of kind of getting ready to do this larger work? And so we thought about ways that they could start in this sort of empowering direction through the actions of the local action food plan. And we picked out 3 different action items that might be really good in the future. Starting with the support and development of comprehensive networks in education. We felt that could sort of culminate in maybe the creation of a local food summit based on racial equity, kind of like what Haley was talking about before, which I think is a great idea. We talked a little bit about engaging those most impacted by health disparities and looking to implement more culturally appropriate food assistance and nutrition. And we thought a good way to start might be the development of a community-focused food equity response team, which would be providing specific resources, knowledge, and networks to people who are the hardest hit by food equity and food access issues on a regular basis. That was one of the things that we saw in the case studies that was really, really interesting. And finally, developing food marketplaces that reflect the culture of diversity of neighborhood. We thought that might kind of culminate in developing or starting the ideal or seeding the ideal of developing maybe economic food hubs in predominantly Black communities around based on entrepreneurship. The local food action plan recently started a local food business portal, which is a really good idea. We felt that could be maybe expanded into thinking about how to develop that into maybe economic hubs in different communities. And so those are maybe 3 ideals for getting started as this sort of larger plan was unfolding. And I'll just end a little bit with some of the best practices and learnings that we felt might be exportable to other people in other circumstances. The big lesson that came out of the study is that it's important to start from the inside. So many organizations start community engagement strategies with the best of intentions, but those activities are sometimes sabotaged by resource challenges that weren't seen, or communication and coordination challenges that maybe weren't seen until it's too late. And so really starting off internally and thinking about, how do we work together? What is our focus? And how can we get the resources together to do what we want to do over the long term is very important. gathering existing resources and knowledge, learning from past engagement practices. Often a lot of these engagement practices and plans stay on the shelf and we end up kind of spending a lot of time reinventing the wheel. Let's look at what communities have already told us. Let's look at what we've been doing and how we can refine that. Let's make space for continual learning through our engagement with communities, learning from the knowledge they have. And let's learn from our partners in spaces like this and even in informal spaces, things like site visits and things like that. Seeking out long-term engagement partnerships that we were talking about. Importantly, leveraging our focus on racial equity right now for a push for greater equity in long-term engagement. And of course, seeking out those grant partners. And finally, engagement starting with relationship building is very important, and using those relationships to build a more meaningful and equitable sort of empowerment strategy and structure down the line. So not losing the importance of relationship building, of listening, and of growing as an organization through what we're learning from communities in developing those empowering structures. And so that's all I have. I don't know if I might have went long, and if I did, I apologize. But certainly if we have time, open for questions, and I will try to be here in the afternoon if anyone has questions as well.
Thanks, Kip. Yes, and for those of you who may not have been on right at the beginning, there is a networking session in the afternoon where we can continue some of this conversation as it relates to local food policy councils. I'll call attention to the chat box. There are links to both the Franklin County and Montgomery County food plans, registration for the Montgomery County Food Summit. And you may have answered this, Kip, within your presentation, but a while back in the beginning of your presentation, there was a question of how did you define empowerment in your findings? If you could expand on that a bit.
It's a really good question. We were really defining it through political and economic autonomy and access to resources. So what we found as a theme in terms of what Black residents and Black community members were asking for were essentially the tools to create and implement policies that affected those communities, and the tools for personal and community wealth building through some of these policies. And so, for instance, we would hear, this is an interesting ideal that this institution wants to, wants to implement, but we're really not in a position of power to, affect this plan or this policy or this initiative in a way that will give us the opportunity to determine our own communities. And then on the flip side, while there were economic opportunities to be had, many of those did not go directly to Black communities. And so empowerment, as we heard it through our study, really kind of were about those two things. We're about autonomy in political action and policy development and local community development.
Thank you. And there was also a question about how you can, if you're able to share the brief or the list of recommendations. And I think Brian had answered that it's a work in progress. So.
Yeah, we are finishing up a final report. We have a recommendations guide, and we're kind of working through that. So as soon as we can finalize those things, we'll be able to share some of that information with others.
Great. I'm sure I can call on Brian to share that out with the listserv when it's available. Thanks.
And then I would just ask if the speakers have any documents they'd like us to link when we upload these recordings to the website. Just send them my way and I'll be happy to paste them in there.
Okay.
Fantastic.
That takes us to the end of our session. Amanda just put a link in, I believe, for where to go next. We have a half-hour break, and then our plenary at noon will take us through the afternoon. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you this afternoon.